All right, so basically I'm going to talk about Zabcon and the Zabbix API interface that I wrote in Ruby. And after I basically plow through this one, I've got a little surprise for everyone on a unrelated topic to this, but something we discussed last year, and I'll get to that after we're done. So once again, you guys remember who I am from yesterday. This is a little bit more of my personal side of things, the website that I run that is associated with all this and so forth. So the API, as many of you guys already know, is built on top of JSON RPC. It is not RESTful. That's something some folks have been talking about here and there. It was designed kind of as a raw interface into some of the core concepts of Zabbix, so that you could basically kind of gain some insight into how Zabbix worked. And it wasn't really set up to have too much of a display layer or something like that. It was a very raw, very direct interface. So it's, and on the one hand, got a lot of power to it and a lot of capabilities, but on the other hand, it does require a little bit of effort, sometimes a little flattening of the head against a wall, and so forth. So, and you know, as I said, because it's raw, basically many of the API calls mimic many of the front-end activities, because it basically came about from a desire within the development community, within the development team, to basically move to something akin to MVC, or Model View Controller, where you basically separate the various layers of how you implement things. So as they were going into that thing, they were kind of separating things out into abstracted interfaces, abstracted classes, and so the API just provided a direct input into that. So how do we access the API? We basically call the server URL with a /API JSON RPC.php. Then we basically just send it some JSON information. The API is forever evolving and improving, fortunately. So the two sources of information are there for you, and also the forum is quite helpful and many times. So if you're having some challenges, some frustrations, that's a good place to go as well. And also oftentimes in IRC. So you can use curl in wget. Challenging, to say the least. Because basically what you're having to do is you're having to use the JSON style of information and basically post that into your wget or curl. So the libraries that basically some people have created kind of help to simplify these things. As we can see here, here's a standard login where basically we don't have an authentication key already. We're going to call the method user.login. We have an ID string. Since this is our first JSON call, we're going to call this an ID of 0. We're using the JSON RPC 2.0 spec, and then we're passing in our params, here, password, API, user, and so forth. And as you can see inside the params, those are hashes. Hashes is basically what a JSON object is, and then we basically get back a result. It's following the JSON 2.0 spec, and the result is here. Now this is our session key that we're basically going to use from here on out inside of the auth field above. But there's an easier way to do a lot of this. So enter the Zabbix API Ruby gem. This Ruby gem, this was actually, I believe, Richard, correct me if I'm wrong here, the first interface library to the API? Or it was one of the first. It has followed somewhat my evolution within Ruby. So the first times you look at some of my older code, don't. So actually one thing to also point out, one core thing I wanted to make sure to do was that you basically instantiate two objects differently from each other. Many of you guys have programmed in Ruby, especially Rails and stuff like that. You're very comfortable with using Active Record. But to the first time user with Active Record, it's kind of confusing about, wait a minute, I have to connect to a second database. How do I connect to a second database with Active Record? Turns out with Active Record, you basically just inherit from the Active Record database object and create a new class and then define everything inside that new class, and bingo, you've now able to talk to multiple database servers within Active Record. I didn't quite like that because I came from somewhat of an older style, having learned C++ and a few of those things where it's like, no, I want to have two independent objects that I interface appropriately. And so that's kind of the key element to this one, is that you basically instantiate each one differently. Also, another key point, this library does support proxy servers. So if you have a a squid server between you and your Zabbix server, you can tell this library, hey, use your proxy server before you contact your Zabbix server. And this is actually quite useful, especially in my own personal development, because my environment tends to sit in California, but I am not in California, and I SSH to my environment because my Zabbix server is not available on the internet, and the only way to access it is through the proxy that I have set up in my SSH tunneling. So that's kind of where that all came about, and other people have actually found it useful as well. So if we were to load up IRB, the interactive Ruby program, and basically run it, we can basically create an interface. So we basically instantiate a ZBX variable. We basically tell it to contact our Zabbix server here. Then basically I'm going to call the set proxy method on top of that and set the proxy that I'm going to talk to. And then on top of that, I'm going to also log in all in one shot. So essentially that one line of code is instantiating our Zabbix object that basically describes our server. It's also connecting to the server via a proxy and logging in as a user. Because each one of those intermediate steps returns the object. And as you can see, we then basically get back a very large object that includes our session ID, as you can see in the auth field, and so forth, the user we've used, and so forth. We've also got various sub objects within it, because the other key thing about this is when we call it, we basically get to use a server.object.method kind of a methodology. So that was another key thing about this too, that kind of strayed from some standard Ruby, if you will, in that when you do server.object, usually you can't quite define sub-objects that call it a parent object. So it was kind of an interesting workaround inside the code, but it actually works out pretty well to essentially allow you to have very readable code to access the Zabbix interface. And as you can see here, we're basically doing a host.get, and we're just pulling back, with the extend output, which basically gives all the information. And here we're basically displaying everything that we've got. So moving on, let's see if we can clean that up with some Ruby code. So basically, we're going to do our Zabbix host.get. We're basically going to call output extend because we want to get all the information. Otherwise, if you call it with just an empty hash, if you will, you'll just get back an array of hashes of just host ID equals a number, and that's it. So that's not quite so useful. So we often have to use the output extend parameter to get some useful information for here. So basically, we're going to call it, we're basically going to iterate through the resultant array of hosts that we've got. And then we're basically going to take this result of hosts, we're going to do a union operation with arrays within Ruby, which makes it really nice to basically say, hey, if our key is inside of this list, then basically this whole thing will be true, or it'll return an array that's either empty or has one element inside the array. So then I just say, hey, is it empty? And because my block is a delete block, I'm basically deleting elements within the hash. So if we go back a step, we can see that there's a lot of information in here, a lot of hash keys. And so we're basically kind of deleting things out. And as you can see, that's a little more readable. So we can do some more interesting things to make it more usable, more readable in some respects in Ruby. But not everyone's a Rubyist programmer. Not everyone wants to write their scripts in Ruby and so forth. So that's where Zabcon came about. Because originally my whole project started as just a raw interface into the library, but then kind of realized, hey, you know what? There could be a command line utility that's more useful. And kind of that's where Zabcon came. It was back, like I say, started back in 2009. The latest in the the version that is out there is 00392. That's actually soon to be incremented. There's a couple of features that are in Subversion that need to be kind of finalized a little bit, and then the latest gem will be pushed out. The easiest way to actually install it, as we'll see here later, is basically just do a gem install Zabcon, and all the dependencies are installed as well. You can also accept commands from standard input. One person at a university in the US had about 1,000 Cisco APIs. He was able to import his large set of information of Cisco APIs in just a few minutes, rather than other methods. And so it was actually quite useful for him in terms of being able to make everything work pretty quickly. So last year, I talked about this a little bit, introduced it. So there's been mostly work kind of in the back end to make some of the parsers and stuff like that work a little more efficiently. We've got some challenges right now that we're working on with Ruby 1.9, but hope to get those done soon. But also last year introduced a new feature called custom commands, which basically allows you to create a custom command that Zabcon will then execute as if it were one of its own internal commands. So as kind of creating some examples, as we went on, we've got like get graph, which will allow you to download a graph and save it on a file rather than having to use like a curl to do that. Because with the first step with curls, you got to log into Zabbix, then you got to save the cookie, but then you have to pull it out. You have to tell wget to save it to a file, but you have to then modify the file and then call wget again with that right cookie. And then there's also a cross-site scripting attack vector that is also involved because there's a session key on top of your cookie. So sometimes you have to do some pretty crazy things to make a lot of that work. So this command kind of helped to simplify that to give you basically one simple interface. Then XML exporting to a file from the command line. I know someone was talking about doing kind of like DR backups and stuff like that. And so one thing that was useful here was, hey, let's do an XML export to a text file from a command line. That's quite useful. And then the next step was hopefully to get XML import working in 1.8 at least. But there are some challenges in how the forms are filled out and executed, because XML is actually not a function within the API itself. So that doesn't exist in 1.8 within the API. And I haven't had to dive too deep into 2.0 yet, so I'm not sure what the functionality there is either. Also, showing triggers is another one that's people have found useful on the command line. So we created a custom command for those. So if you're going to execute Ruby or Zabcon, this is basically what it looks like to execute it. A very straightforward process to connect to it, and as you can see, get result returns results and looks in a table very similar to what you'd find inside of MySQL client. So it's basically designed to make this easier to read, easier to see. You can also tell it to show only specific fields. So if you see like get host, show equals, and then send it basically a list of host ID or column headers, it will then show only those column headers for you. So that also kind of makes it easier to do. So as you noticed, when we connected, we did a login statement. So there's actually a way that you don't have to do a login statement. You basically set up a Zabcon configuration file that basically stores everything. Now, one big change from last year was it only supported one Zabbix server. Zabcon now has the understanding of multiple Zabbix servers. The eventual goal is to have something where within the command line you can connect to multiple Zabbix servers and maybe start doing some differentiation between your two Zabbix servers. Because one of the questions that someone came to me last year and says, hey, I've got 5 or 6 Zabbix servers. I want to be able to search my Zabbix server to look for a host to see which one it's being monitored by. And that's kind of a very unique use case. So with this one, you can kind of approximate it now if you basically wrap Zabcon inside of a bash script, because Zabcon understands multiple servers within its configuration file, and then it's just a matter of doing Zabcon-S and the server name that you gave it, and it will then log in. Another one that it also tries to do, so here's the configuration files we're talking about, to various servers, that we, that we basically, that I kind of use for development and stuff like that. So, and I can call it with any one of those servers if I want to. Here we're connecting to it. Here's a kind of example of the latest version that that I'm working on. Loading our custom commands, some information about where we're going. Here we're going to show just specific column entries we want. We're only going to show 3 results. So you can see it kind of makes it very straightforward. When you call it from within a script, you don't get a table result. You actually just get a CSV back as well. So it does understand if, hey, am I being called interactively or am I being called inside of a script? And changes the output appropriately. You can also change the delimiter character as well, should your application need that. So, here's how we basically call it inside of a script. And you can see, the results definitely change as appropriate. We can also call the API directly within Zabcon. So if we, let's say, have something that the API library does not understand, or is not in, so is not in, the Zabbix API library, or Zabcon doesn't understand the command, you can basically call the API directly using the raw API command. So it's basically raw API, the method you want to call, and then the parameters you want to pass to it, and then it will return the result for you. Custom commands I was talking about. So we here's how we develop a custom command. So we basically say we're going to add a new custom command. We're going to give it the command name of custom. We're now going to set the method for it. We're going to receive our parameters from Zabcon. So we're going to basically modify those and then do what we want to with them. In this case, we're just going to connect to the server. We're just going to issue a raw API, call to the server, and we're just going to use the user get with no parameters we're going to pass in, and then we're just going to do the results. There is a help field capability as well. That's a separate file, and it's basically set by the tag which you call into the file. So we're saying no output, and or no help tag, and then we're just going to do standard print on the output. So time for me to finish up on this one. A little brief overview. We talked about Zabbix and the API and Zapcon, how it can kind of help to simplify a lot of those capabilities. We also now have a mailing list that's also new from last year. So any gripes, changes, or discussions or whatever, feel free to go to the various locations. Any questions on this one? All right, time to move on to the next one. So this was something I presented last year. And so basically this is my presentation from last year. I'm not going to go into as detail as I did last year on this one. Instead, I'm just going to discuss some of the core crazy bits. So why the heck did I do this? I basically built a Lua interface, scripting engine, if you will, inside of the Zabbix server. Many reasons, crazy. I like reading undocumented code, which has actually been improving, thank God. So thank you to the developers for writing comments. It is appreciated. So basically, the languages I looked at Ruby, Python, Lua. Lua was chosen because it's a lightweight, simple scripting language. It's also written in C. Since the Zabbix server is written in C, it needs to stay inside of that. So anything that uses C++ is going to be challenging because of the way the stack is handled within parameter passing for methods. So you can do it, requires a little bit of a wrapper to it, but it does make it a little more challenging and so forth. In addition, Ruby and Python require a lot more memory up front to run, and they also require a little more time to do an initial compile of whatever they're doing. Ruby, as much as I love Ruby, didn't feel that was appropriate here. In addition, the fully dynamic nature of Ruby may have actually been a hindrance because of the time penalties that would incur, since everything inside the Zabbix server does need to run quickly. So the long-term goals at this point last year were in flux. However, I do have something to say that basically I'm going to try and start this as one of the first community projects to interface with the developers to hopefully get this included into Zabbix at some point in the future. Probably not 2.2, but so look in the forums. I'm going to try and start talking to some other people, create the group and get some people involved who want to see this happen. There's already been 3 other people who've contacted me. One person actually put this into production because they need to do some linear algebra equations inside of their environment, inside their Zabbix server. And Zabcon, the Lua component allowed them to do linear algebra as part of their monitoring. Definitely quite a crazy concept. So let's see. Yep, more help. Yeah, other people that use it, World of Warcraft, that's used as their scripting configuration files. Wireshark uses it to script inside of Wireshark if you want to make things faster. Light HTTPD uses it as its CGI engine. And the awesome window manager uses it to basically help manage actions within everything you do. Simple things about Lua, it's interpretive, case sensitive. It's a very small language overall. There's only 26 operators or symbols within the language. As you can see, some of the comments are really straightforward. Double dash comment, double dot is concatenate 2 strings together, and then the hash is basically a length operation. So it's if I remember right, variable hash, and that gives you the length or hash variable, something along those lines. Can't remember exactly at the moment. So it's also dynamically typed, which is kind of nice in terms of other pieces of it, but it does have some typing in there as well, which is nice. So if we want to create something, create a variable, my var equals 5, we just created a variable. It's dynamically in that nature. We want to create a function. We basically say what the function is, what the parameters are to it, and then we basically do what we want to do and return from there. Calling the function's fine. Once again, if we have an array, that's what it looks like. So we create a function, the factorial function. Hey, this is what it looks like. Very simple language. So this was the original repository location from last year. Someone else has forked it into GitHub, and that fork was following 1.9 for a while. However, about 8 months ago, that stopped developing, and soon hope to have a new site for that one, so that people who are interested can go there and start working together, and we can basically make this useful. So we, little things on installing it. But hey, enough of the background. Let's actually see what you're probably more interested in. What did it look like? So when we go into an item and we create a new item inside there, because at the time, Lua only worked as items, but they worked as items inside the server. So it's kind of an interesting one. You basically go in and you create an item of type Lua. As you can see, type Lua script. We give it a key because everything has to have a key within Zabbix. It will also take each one of these parameters inside of here, inside of the key, actually as arguments that get passed into the script. So the concept there was to eventually have like a scripting library, if you will, where you have like a set of Lua scripts that you write that are common across everything, and then you can dynamically use them by basically passing parameters here at this point. So we basically say, hey, we're just going to return these 2 variables, and we're going to store it into this item that we have. So when we ran it, hey, that's what we got. Hello world, every single time, every, 30 seconds. So this ran every 30 seconds, and we got hello world every 30 seconds stored into the database. We could have done some processing, we could have done something else, maybe some time functions and so forth. We did have a few very basic functions as well. We had the ability to pull the latest value for an item specifically. And just that one function alone actually made this pretty powerful. And like I say, one person was able to use this with linear algebra. They'd query the database for multiple parameters throughout their environment and say, okay, what were their values? Now let's take those values, throw them into an equation. And now let's store that inside of our, back into the database, and now we can trigger against it. One goal that I had in mind back in my head on this one were basically 3 pieces. The first step was to do items such as this. The second step was to do triggers. Can you all imagine how powerful it would be if you could write a trigger in a language like this? You could now basically have multivariable triggers that work along with heuristics, scanning, and a whole bunch of other things. now start to add some statistical analysis into this and regression analysis. And you can start to do predictive triggering as well. And the power really becomes pretty amazing. But what's even cooler about it in a way, how much did we really add to the Zabbix server? Not much. But did we let the user do it? Yes, you did. So the development work up front is really just in allowing this framework to allow people to extend it themselves rather than have to, dig deep into each piece. It isn't the be-all, end-all for features because it never will be, but it's basically designed as a extension. It will never be as fast as new features either, so that's another trade-off, but at least allows the flexibility. So as we say here, we've basically wrote a little script that pulls an item from the database. We actually also output something to the log file because it also understands how to output to the Zabbix server's log file. And we basically post a message into the log file. We pull the current clock. We do some, we didn't pull the clock. We basically pull the last value and that returns two items. The clock time of the value when it was stored and the value itself. And so then we just return its value and store it into the database. Pretty simple, but you can see how interesting something like that is. Like I said, the functions that were available, very simple. Get the last item, get a host ID, or get an item ID based on, as we can see previously, a host name and a key name. So being able to look up the ID that you need to then work with is pretty useful as well. And then we can pull the last value that we want, even worked with a multi-node configuration as well. And then current time and so forth. So the whole idea was to be small and powerful. And I also forgot one other thing that was the next step was maybe to have something along the lines of a pre-connection hook. Imagine if you could do a hook into the server before it connects to the client that it wants to connect to. If you can do a hook there and manipulate that communication before it goes out to the client, that could be pretty useful for very specific situations. In addition, what if you had a hook for receive? You could now modify the reception of data before it goes into the database for whatever thing you need to do. So two hooks there, and then other hooks in places like, hey, what if the item becomes unsupported? Maybe you might want to hook there and try and re-support it, or other places. So a lot of those ideas, want to get some people together and start talking about those ideas and start figuring out what a roadmap, a plan would be, and then start figuring out how we basically start working with the Zabbix developers and kind of make this a reality. So that's all.
I liked it a lot because if I think of some funky SNMP implementations where temperatures are returned a string plus degrees centigrade or something, that'd be very handy to just cut that off.
Yeah, and as an extension to that, I don't know how feasible it would be, but we might be able to do things like, hey, you connect to a host, pull a data point back, but you realize, you need to get another one from another location. Now you do another connection. So maybe you could do double connections. I don't know how that would look or how that would work or the problems that may create as well. But we might be able to start thinking about some of those crazy concepts in there as well. And just like you say, fix the units challenge that occurs between many systems.
Are you thinking already on some front end stuff? For example, the export of all the scripts that you've so meticulously made?
Yes, that would definitely be something worth thinking about. I haven't thought about that in that realm, but I could definitely see something like that being useful in, if you had like a library function where you create a library of Lua functions that you could then use throughout your environment. To export to a file or make an API interface to that so you can download it or import it through the API, which then allows for a lot more dynamic information or dynamic dynamic configuration to your environment. But yeah, that would definitely be something worth adding to that list.
And also for information sharing, for example, if I can export all the stuff I've done, I can share it with the community. Yeah,
and those are things that as a community, working on a project like this, we would need to come up with and figure out how to solve those. Because, as it was mentioned yesterday, there are a set of coding standards, there are a set of appropriate methods of coding within the Zabbix server and agent and so forth that need to be followed. So we need to make sure that we understand a lot of those pieces and could be able to do those things. Yeah.
Any more questions? Yep.
Is a script run inside the server process?
Yes. So basically what I didn't show is there's a configuration file change in addition in this current version, which basically starts what is called a Lua script process. So it basically runs just like a normal Polar, just like a housekeeper, many of those. So it is a separate thread within the Zabbix server. So each Lua script runs in each one of those independent threads. Because Zabbix is multi-threaded, that does make for some very interesting contention locking issues when programming. But this actually does handle that, in a multi-threaded manner. I remember my test environment, I think I was up to about 3 different Lua threads running at the exact same time, sometimes running the same script. So that, that's how that would work. And just like with Polar, if your Lua script is, not, you're finding you're not running those, or they're having issues running, then you have to, add more threads for those or something like that. So.
I'm not familiar with this Lua, but how about the practical things? Database libraries available, SNMP libraries, and etc. Is there any?
No. So the one library that you do need to import is the Lua development libraries. Wherever possible, I always try to use internal Zabbix calls wherever possible. So in terms of, in this version that I just demoed, it does not have the ability to actually connect to a host. It doesn't have the ability to use the internal TCP connection routines inside Zabbix. Instead, it did understand how to talk with the internal cache to poll for information and pull that out by using some internal Zabbix functions that actually do those actions themselves. So wherever possible, every effort is made to use internal Zabbix functions to not import, additional library requirements. In addition, should those function calls within Zabbix get modified for new capabilities, we're using internal functions so that we don't have to necessarily worry as much about, okay, are we doing things right? Or, oh, well, now the logic's changed, we've got to change our function. We're using, what other developers will be changing to alter for the logic. If that makes sense.